In this video, I'm going to be discussing a new plugin that I just released, and that is called Select Saturation. This plugin is for Photoshop version 24.4.1 or higher. And the reason why is because this uses a new imaging API feature that Adobe just released. So this plugin cannot be made to work in prior versions to that. Also, if you are on Photoshop 25 or higher, which is CC 2024, and I'm running the beta version of that now, on 25 and higher, this will record into a Photoshop action, which is a new feature that Adobe just released for the plugins menu in version 25. So the purpose of this plugin is exactly what it says in the name. It's to make a selection based on the saturation of your image. And the reason why you would want to do this is so you can create something called a saturation mask. So in this image, for example, let's say we wanted to pull out some color in the sky, and we can look and see that this saturation value of the sky is really low. So 7%, 9%, 11%. I mean, it's a pretty low saturation. Other parts of the image are already highly saturated, like 83%, for example, over here, 86% where I clicked over here. So what happens is if you try to run a standard hue saturation adjustment, if we're pulling up the saturation to, let's say we wanted to make this sky just really pop with those pinks and the purples with this lightning striking. By the time we turn this up high enough to have that effect we want, the rest of this image is just completely oversaturated. We've also got in Photoshop the vibrance adjustment. That's got a vibrance and a saturation adjustment slider. Let's start with the saturation. The same thing. By the time we get this up high enough to have an effect in the sky we want, the rest of this is oversaturated. I will point out too that this saturation algorithm works different than the one under the hue saturation adjustment. For the saturation under the vibrance adjustment layer, this is a newer adjustment layer. This doesn't have as strong of an effect on the lower saturated areas than the hue saturation adjustment does. But still the same thing though. We're not able to get enough color in the sky before the rest of the image is completely blown out for the saturation. Now the vibrance slider, you notice we turn this all the way up to 100. We're not oversaturating those areas, and that is because the vibrance slider actually is saturation with a masking applied. It's got a saturation mask built in. However, we're not able to pull up the saturation values of the sky here enough to really give that effect we want. And by the way, in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, these adjustments work similar to this vibrance adjustment layer in Photoshop. Although in Lightroom or Camera Raw, I think that the vibrance is a little bit stronger. In any case, what I'm going to do here is show you a method that I like to do to pull out color in areas that don't have a lot of color and not oversaturate the rest of the image. I'm going to do this. I'm actually going to do this in the advanced method I use where I create two layers. So let's select. I'm going to click on this button called Invert Selection. And I'm going to leave it on single layer since we just got a single layer image here. And I'm going to make a selection here, and it's going to make the selection based on the inverse of the saturation. I'm going to give it a hue saturation adjustment layer. I'm using this one instead of the vibrance because this gives a stronger effect to the lower saturated areas. Now with this hue saturation adjustment layer, even with the mask, you never want to go up to 100% because that really just sort of overdoes it. So I'm going to start out, I'm going to go a little bit more than I probably normally would just so you can see the effect better in the video. but I'm going to go up to 70% here. And so with that mask here, we are applying this saturation stronger to the areas that were lower saturation, such as the sky and water, and it's being applied at a lower percentage to those areas that already had a high saturation. And so if I disable this mask, you can see that there's more saturation now in this area. One thing you can do is you can come in to this mask and run a curves on the mask. This is getting kind of advanced here, but I think this plugin is more for advanced users anyway, so hopefully those who want to use this technique and use this masking can follow. But with this curves layer, I'm really pushing the effect down on the areas that we don't want saturated. And if we look at this now, we can see that I've really darkened up those areas that started out with that really high saturation. So now we're having even less of an effect on this. So if we look at the original here, then look at now after I've applied those curves, you can see that we've had almost no effect on this area, but we've really brought the saturation out in the sky. I'm going to back up a ways here. I'm going to undo that curves because I want to show you another technique I like to do. You can do this technique with or without the curves, but it's with the second adjustment layer. I'm going to do it without the curves applied. So now we're looking at just the straight up saturation mask inverted. But I'm going to duplicate this layer. So Control J on Windows or Command J on Mac. Now we've got the same adjustment being applied twice, but on the one underneath, I'm going to go into that mask. I'm going to invert that mask. Yeah, it was Control I on Windows or Command I on Mac, but now I am applying this adjustment stronger to the areas that had higher saturation and lower to the areas that had lower saturation. Then I'm going to do the exact opposite. I'm going to pull down the saturation. So if I go all the way down here on this, you see that I'm really desaturating these areas that started out with higher saturation. I'm not going to go all the way down to 100, of course, but just to kind of show you in the video what's happening. Might turn this down to like -20 or -25, somewhere in there. And that's going to allow us to push the top adjustment up even more. I may have overdone it with that -25, maybe -20. But now let's look at the original and look at this one with the double masking. If you look at these areas in here, you see that these areas look almost unchanged in the roof area, that where it had those orange colors. We're really not oversaturating those, but we've really brought all that color out in the sky. So if we sample around the image here, you see that the combined image, where we had 7 to 11% saturation in that range, now we're running around 25% saturation. And I mean, it varies a little bit, but 27% here, but just enough to kind of pull some of those colors out in the sky. And in the water too, we've got like 36% saturation. But if you look over in these areas that started out in the 80s, I've actually pulled the saturation values down on those some. So they're in the, actually there's some in the 80s there, but we're not oversaturating is the point. We're pretty similar to what we were to start with in those areas. So that's just one way you can use this plugin. Like I say, this plugin is more for advanced users because there's quite a bit you can do with the saturation selection. So whatever you do with it is up to you, but how to actually use the plugin itself is very simple. You just select your two options. You're either making a selection based on a layer or based on the combined document as if it were merged. So if you had multiple layers and you use the merged option, it'll make the selection based on the combined saturation. Pretty much what you see is what you get. It's not going to merge them, but it'll make the selection based on that. then you can invert that if you want. And that's pretty much it. I've got a more advanced video where I go into some advanced stuff in the masking and discuss how masks themselves work, and in particular with the nonlinear grayscale color profile that mask use. So if you're interested in a little bit more in-depth technical stuff, watch the next video that discusses some more details about the inner workings of this. So anyways, thanks for watching.